Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, in the previous class, I was talking about the communication process, and I have discussed participants, messages, meanings, symbols, and I was discussing the context. So before I do proceed, I would like to revise the previous lecture, not previous lecture, but previous point. So the communication process. Communication is the process of creating or sharing meaning in informal conversation, group interaction, or public speaking. To understand how this process works, we begin by describing its essential elements. Participants, the people, or the things which are involved in this process, they're called participants. Then messages, what's being conveyed, context, what is the setting, channels, how the message is being conveyed, interference, what is the distraction, and feedback, suddenly the reaction to the message. So this the study of all this phenomenon is called the communication process. Then I discussed the participants. The participants are the individuals who assume the roles of senders and receivers during an interaction. As senders, participants form and transmit messages using verbal symbols, visual images, and nonverbal behavior. As receivers, they interpret the message that they have been transmitted to them. Then messages. Messages are the verbal utterances, visual images, and nonverbal behaviors to which meaning is attributed during communication. To understand how messages are created and received, we need to understand meanings, symbols, encoding and decoding, and form like organization. So your messages that may be the verbal utterances like you're speaking right now, I'm speaking, visual images, it can be the writing, it can be an image, a photograph, a painting, and then nonverbal behaviors. These are the nonverbal expressions, facial expression, hand movements, voice, speed, pitch, eye contact, posture. So these all are actually the non-verbal behaviors because they do convey the messages. And messages actually the meaning. Okay, so meaning include the thought in your mind as well as the interpretations you make of another's message. So meanings are the way participants make sense of the messages. So I have something in my mind and I want to convey to someone else. So what would I do? Certainly I'll form that meaning or message in the form of message. So this is how we do communicate, we do understand, we do interpret others' meanings. Then symbols. So what are the symbols? So to express yourself, you form messages made of verbal symbols like words, non-verbal cues like behaviors, and visual images. So symbols are words, sounds, and actions that represent specific ideas and feelings. So this is important. Anything in the form of words, sounds, and action that represents a specific idea or feeling is called symbols. As you speak, you choose words, symbols to express your meaning. At the same time, you also use facial expressions, eye contact, gestures, and tone of voice, all symbolic nonverbal cues in an attempt to express your meaning. So what happens whenever we are communicating with someone, we use any of the mediums or media and we convey our messages in the form of sound, symbols, gestures, postures, and all. Your listeners make interpretations or attribute meaning to the messages they receive. When you offer your messages through a variety of symbols, the meaning you're trying to convey become clearer. So, symbolically, certainly these are symbols because anyone who is not familiar with these symbols, the sounds or gestures or postures, for him all such expressions are meaningless. They're just symbols. So if you do not know the meaning of any specific gesture, for you or any word or any other thing, so that is the meaningless. For example, these days modern symbols and gestures and hand movements have become in use and they have become fashion. So we do find that people are making certain symbols with their hands, and a layman like me is not easy to comprehend or understand what this specific message is conveying. But the one who knows the real context or the meaning of that symbol, so for him it is not only the symbol but also the meaning, because there was a hidden meaning inside that gesture or posture. Then we discussed encoding, the process of putting our thoughts and feelings into words and nonverbal cues. Now, there is a process, it's a mental process, it's the brain process. Brain itself processes your feelings and converts that into a specific form, like sound, symbols, gestures, postures, anything else. So that process is called encoding. And decoding is the process of interpreting author's message. Ordinarily, you do not consciously think about either the encoding or the decoding process. Only when there is a difficulty, such as speaking in a second language or having to use an easier vocabulary with your children, do you become aware of encoding. So one thing is for sure, you need to understand that these two of these processes take place in sender's and receiver's mind, but we don't intentionally perform. Our brain does not intentionally perform. Like, we don't first start doing decoding or encoding. No, never. It is a natural process. Like I'm speaking extempore right now. So if I'm speaking extempore, so I am not actually providing the set of instructions to my brain. Rather, brain is providing set of instructions to me, and it's so swift, it's so smart that I'm not able to locate that fluency that is being created ultimately or automatically. So brain performs everything automatically, like nature helps. Then four, when the meaning we wish to share is complex, we may need to organize it in sections or in a certain order. So message form is especially important when one person talks without interruption for a relatively long time, such as in a public speech or when reporting an event to a colleague at work. So, visual images also need to be organized and in a good form if they are to aid understanding. So, certainly, good idea is not a good idea until it is given a good shape or a form or organization. So an unorganized expression is meaningless. Like, it won't be conveying, the meaning. Okay, so organization is, or form or structure is important. Sorry, and then context. This is the point from where we did leave. The context is composed of the physical, social, historical, psychological, and cultural situation in which a communication encounter occurs, including what proceeds and follows what is said. According to noted German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, the ideal speech situation is impossible to achieve, but considering its context as we communicate with others can move us closer to that goal. The context affects the expectations of the participants, the meaning these participants derive, and their subsequent behavior. So, what is the context? Simply, it is the setting in which communication occurs, including what precedes and follows what is said. Now, context is a special setting in which you are communicating with someone. So, what happened earlier and what happened in later course of time is included in context. So that's why the politician or celebrities, whenever they do say anything or any of their comment is shared on social media, so they say that their statement has been presented or shared without knowing the context. So it is for sure, we need to see the physical, social, historical, psychological, and cultural setting first. Okay, let's quickly discuss physical context. Well, the physical context includes the location, the environmental conditions like temperature, lighting, and noise level, the distance between communicators, and the time of day. Each of these factors can affect the communication. For instance, the meaning shared in a conversation may be affected by whether it is held in a crowded company cafeteria, an elegant candlelit restaurant, over the telephone, or the internet. Now, physical context matters a lot. If you are sitting with your friend so close, so you won't be shouting, certainly. You may communicate in whispers. But if your friend is sitting quite far from you, so you may shout. Apparently, shouting is considered something unethical, but here there is a physical distance between the communicators, so we shouldn't take this shouting as something unethical, unsocial, but as the need of the physical context, because there was a difference. So that's why when we are sitting in a room and the television is on, the fan is making noise, and children are playing around, and you're communicating with someone on telephone, so you'll be naturally a little louder than the normal speech. But suddenly it is the blackout, the light goes away. So what happened? There is utter silence. So if there is silence, everyone is mute. So what will you do? You will start speaking slowly. You will not raise your voice. Why? Because now you're not having the external noise. Okay? So its external noise is now over. So the physical context like the noise level, the lighting and temperature has been changed, so you will speak in a very normal tone, rather slow, in a whisper like tone. So that's the physical context. So while evaluating the communication episode, one needs to understand that what was actually the context. Don't infer anything without knowing the context. So for a good communicator and for a good learner, a good person, a good manager or administrator must know the the setting first. Then he or she has to you know designate or attribute the meaning to the certain communication process. Number two is the social context, simply the nature of the relationship that exists between the participants. Now, social context is the nature of relationship between the participants, whether communication takes place among family members, friends, acquaintances, work associates, or strangers influences what and how messages are found, shared, and interpreted. For instance, most people change how they interact when talking with their parents or siblings as compared to how they interact with talking with their friends. So certainly the social background, the social setting changes the way or the mode of your communication and the language even. If you're talking to your friends, so you will be quite open, you'll be talking freely, but when you are talking to your teachers, so you will be quite, yeah, good in your expression. So it depends upon the social context. So without knowing the social context, so do not elaborate anything, do not attribute any meaning, because since you don't know, so you won't be able to understand. So knowing social context is very important. Okay. Historical context. This is very important, very very important. This the historical context is the background provided by previous communication episodes between the participants. Suppose I was talking to someone. Now we left at some certain points the debate, and I'm taking my class. Suddenly, that person opens the door, and I do not start the communication from the same point. I just say something which seems meaningless to the students because they are not familiar with the historical context. So for them, it'll be troublesome. It won't create any meaning. But we are actually the ones, the one with whom I'm communicating, and he and I both are actually familiar with the previous episode of communication which took place earlier at any point. So for us, it's meaningful. So historical context is the background provided by previous communication episodes between the participants. Well, it influences understandings in the current encounter. For instance, suppose one morning Chad tells Shelby that he will pick up the rough draft of a paper they had given to their professor for feedback to help prepare the final manuscript. When Shelby joins Chad for lunch in the cafeteria, she says, "Did you get it?" Now, another person listening to the conversation would have no idea what that it is. Okay? Yes, Chad quickly replies, it's on my desk. So Shelby and Chad would understand each other because the content of their previous conversation provides the context for understanding what it is in the exchange. But for the other people who were not involved in that previous episode, conversation episode, so for them it won't be understandable. And then there comes psychological context. Now, the psychological context includes the moods and feelings each person brings to the interpersonal encounter. For instance, suppose Karine is under a lot of stress while she is studying for an exam. A friend stops by and pleads with her to take a break and go to the gym with her. Now, Karine, who is normally good natured, may explode with an angry tirade. Why? Because her stress level provides the psychological context within which she hears this message and affects how she responds. Now, psychological context, what is happening inside the brain, we do not know. So most of the times, uh, the a worse communication feedback is actually the result of not knowing the psychological context. One must understand. Suppose most of the times teacher come in the class, they start teaching to the class, and a student asks a question, and the teacher becomes so much angry, and the students start drawing, some results, and it's not good, because you do not know how much tense the teacher was, or what happened during the travel to the university. So, and teacher must also know that if you're asking a question from a student and he isn't able or she isn't able to answer it properly, so there must be some psychological issue, psychological background with which we are not familiar. So, it's better to understand the psychological context, or give some room to the mistake, to the person for such mistakes or such errors which may be the result of psychological context. So, what's happening in your brain and what psychologically you have experienced, that is reflected in your communication. Then cultural context. Now, cultural context is are the values, attitudes, beliefs, orientations, and underlying assumptions uh, prevalent among people in a society. So the cultural context includes the values, beliefs, orientations, underlying assumptions, and rituals prevalent among people in a society. Now, culture penetrates into every aspect of our lives, affecting how we think, talk, and behave. So each of us belongs to many cultural groups, though we may differ in how much we identify with each group. I give you an example. For example, uh, in Pakistan, having a proper eye contact with a female uh, is not considered good. And if a girl is staring at you, uh, it is not considered good. But as per communication aesthetics, it's good to have a proper eye contact, and it's considered normal in this part of the world. But in the West, if you're talking to someone and not having proper eye contact, so it is considered unethical. It is considered the person is not paying attention or not paying respect to me. So because it's the cultural context is different, so we shouldn't infer any meaning that in Pakistan and in Muslim societies, if the girl is not staring at you, is not having a proper eye contact, she is actually not a good communicator. No, because she's having a certain culture, she's representing a certain culture in which it is not considered something good. So, and I personally believe that there must be some respect. Okay, so while talking to the female, one must not look directly into the eyes, because it may create problems. It may, okay, it's offensive, I personally feel. Why I personally feel? Because it's a cultural context. But it's the culture, the legacy which we are carrying over on our shoulders. So these are some of the contexts. So we need to understand these, that in which context the communication process is taking place. Now next comes the channels. Now channels are both the route traveled by the message and means of transportation. So messages are transmitted through sensory channels. Face-to-face communication has three basic channels. Number one, verbal symbols, non-verbal cues, and visual images. So these are the channel route, the route which is being used for communication. Technologically mediated communication use these same channels. So like we send our messages, and messages don't reflect our emotions. Now these days we have got so much liberty and some advantages through emojis and through some photographs. We convey our feelings, and we can make our photograph and send. So but in earlier days when there were Nokia 3310, We didn't have such luxuries to directly convey our feelings and emotions. So now you have plenty of things through which you can convey your gestures, feelings, and emotions. So these are actually the channels. Well, so technological media communication uses these same channels through nonverbal cues such as movement, touch, and gestures are represented by visual symbols like emoticons, like textual images that symbolize the sender's mood, emotions, or facial expressions. Like what when you're talking to someone directly, so when you touch, when you smile, and when you have a proper facial gesture, so it makes your language, your communication process a healthy one, an interactive one, and meaningful. But when you are using the technology and you're at quite distant, at quite a distant place, so you would certainly use these things to add more life to your message. So this is called channel. Now interference. Interference is called the noise. Interference noise or noise is a stimulus that hinders, like that resists the process of sharing meanings. So interference can be physical or psychological. Interference means rukavat. It means shore, problem, mazahmat. So once, while you are communicating with someone, you would encounter two kinds of interference. Number one, physical interference, and number two, psychological interference. Okay, so physical interference includes the sights, sounds, and other stimuli in the environment that draw people's attention away from intended meaning. Well, when you are sitting in a classroom which has the sofas and there is an AC working at 16 degrees centigrade, and there is a light music and the color, combination of the class is so romantic, and there is a teacher who is teaching philosophy, so no one is gonna pay attention to the teacher because the room is such a luxurious one, and it'll cast a spell that is more romantic than philosophical. So what would happen is the physical interference. The people are actually involved in a physical setting, so they're not paying attention. So this is called physical context. Now, on the other side, psychological interference includes internal distraction based on thoughts and feelings and can fall into two categories: internal noise and semantic noise. Now, what is the psychological interference? We've discussed the psychological setting that sometimes you have the fear, you have some psychological problems that don't allow you to understand the message directly. There are two types of these psychological interferences. Number one, internal noise, and another one is semantic noise. Now, internal noise refers to thoughts and feelings that compete for attention and interfere with the communication process. If you have ever turned out to the lecture your professor is giving and tuned into a daydream or a past conversation, then you have experienced internal noise, like you have some psychological issues internally. You are somewhere else. Most of the times when we do offer our prayers in the mosque, what I've experienced that I am actually offering my prayer, but I'm thinking something else internally. My mind is, wandering in other, places, at other places. So that's called the internal psychological noise. Now, the second one is important: semantic noise. It refers to the distraction aroused by certain symbols that take our attention away from the main message. If a friend describes a 40-year-old secretary as the girl in the office, And you think girl is an odd and condescending term for a 40-year-old. No, certainly, if certainly she's a girl, but a 40 years old lady is not a girl. So sometimes you misunderstand because you were not aware of the semantic leap of the speaker or the association or the bond with some certain jargon. So, suppose if a person is, oh, hello, young man, and there is an old man, and you're listening, and the person is, I met a young man in the office. Now, you were actually praising an old man's energies. And so that's why you say that, oh, young man, how are you? But a person, now he would have a semantic interference. He won't be able to because he hasn't seen the person. So this is called the internal noise. So that's why. And the final thing in the communication process is feedback. So feedback is the reactions and responses to a message that indicates to the sender whether and how the message was heard, seen, and interpreted. In face to face communication, we can express feedback verbally, through words, or non verbally, through body language. In online interaction, we can express feedback verbally, through words, or non verbally, through emoticons and acronyms. Now, feedback is simply the response of the message. As we teach in the class, and when we ask, are you getting our point? So everyone nods the head. So you're giving the feedback that may be deceiving one, that may be the tricky one, but certainly feedback is the feedback. So it's the response to the message. So this is the communication process, the diagram of the communication process. You can see this is the sender, this is the receiver. Encoding is taking place in sender's mind, and decoding takes place in the receiver's mind. There is a meaning in sender's mind, and there is certainly the meaning in the sender's mind, receiver's mind, who has actually inferred through the message. Okay, now he is turning the message into the form of any sound symbol gestures, and it's being conveyed to this receiver. And if he gives the feedback which is expected, so the communication process is 100% is accurate. So with all this, I do conclude, I sign off. See you next time. Allah Hafiz.